For this session, I'm going to instruct you on how to create a fluid design while explaining a little bit about percentages and also a little bit about absolute positioning with CSS. I'm going to start with a basic HTML skeleton. I've got a little bit of content plugged in here for us. I've got a title. I've got a link to a CSS file that I have not made yet. I've got a placeholder for it file, but it's all blank, so nothing in our CSS yet. Inside the body, I've got a container with the customary 4 divs inside. I've got a header, a nav, column 1, column 2, all inside the container, and then a footer outside of the container. Now, at this point in my teaching, I generally have only showed what we would refer to as fixed width layouts. That means we create this container. We create this div that wraps around or contains all of our other divs, and we give it a fixed layout. Now, this isn't the only way to do layouts. We can also create layouts that are based upon percentages of our screen. This technology has been around a very, very long time, and it's not something that's new or cutting edge by any means. By today's standards, all the rage is all about responsive design and how we can make websites work on mobile devices and tablets and computers, large and small, all creating a user experience that works well. This is not responsive, but this is a portion of responsive. You can't really fully learn responsive design until you learn this method, which is referred to as fluid design or liquid design. You see it both ways in textbooks and blogs and tutorials. A lot of times they'll call it liquid. Sometimes they'll call it fluid. It's the same concept. There's a third type of layout called elastic. And you don't see that used as much, but that's sort of this hybrid combination of a fixed layout with some fluid elements inside of it. So we'll take a look at all of these technologies, and you can certainly mix and match and play with these at your leisure. So if you haven't got your HTML copied down yet, go ahead and pause the video and do that. Otherwise, I'm going to jump over to the CSS. That's where everything really is going to happen. So I'm going to start by making a container. Now, we typically have 4 properties in a general container. We have a width, a background color or image so we can see it. We have a margin of auto, and we also have an overflow of hidden. Most of that will not change, but the values will. So let's go ahead and start with, we'll start with the standard stuff. Let's do overflow hidden. I'll give it a background color of a very light gray, just so we can see it on our screen. Next, I'll give it a margin of auto that will center it in the middle of our screen, and I'm also going to give it a width, but this time I'm going to give it a width of a percentage. Now, if you know anything about percentages, you know that it's a number from 0 to 100, and we can't really do fractions, so it's going to be a whole number, 1 through 100. I'm sorry, 0 through 100. You can actually have 0. 0 through 100. If, for example, I do a 100% width, I can save that and go take a look at this in a browser now. And at this point, before I refresh this, you'll see that the browser just shows all of my content. I don't have any sort of color or design on it. If I refresh this now, I can see that I've got this gray container, and you don't get the leisure of seeing everything on my screen, but if I adjust my browser window, you can see that this gray container div is going just about the entire width of the design. Now, there is a little bit of a margin out here to the top and left and right. That's your normal page margins. And if you want to take those off just for the sake of actually seeing if this works at 100%, we can come back into our CSS and create the body tag. Excuse me. And we can give the body tag a margin of 0px. I'm going to go ahead and give this body a background color as well. And I'll give it a background of EEE, a very, very, very light gray. This is going to look almost white. While we're here, in the body tag, this is also where you can specify things like your default font. So if you'd like everything on your page to be the Tahoma font, you can specify the font family there, and it should take care of that throughout the entire document. Go back to my browser window. And there we go. I can see that from browser edge to edge, it goes all the way to the edge. There's no buffer around the top or the margin sides or anything. So that means my container indeed is going 100%. I also see that the background color here, including the footer, is kind of a light gray. It's almost white, but it's a very, very light gray. So when I'm looking at the CSS, this width of 100%, it begs the question, 100% of what? And with CSS, percentages are always based on the thing that it's inside of. So we can say that the container, for example, is 90%. And if we make that 90% and go back to our browser, now the container is 90% wide, no matter how large or small my browser window is. So it's important to understand that the width is not necessarily the width of the entire screen or the entire monitor. It's based on the window that this is in. Now, what is the container in? Well, the container is in the body. And the body, by default, has a small margin on the inside of it. So unless we take that margin down to 0, we don't see the full width of the screen. So the container, we're going to make 90% here, and I'll live with that for probably the majority of this demo. I'm going to scroll down a bit and go ahead and start adding some of the internal elements like the header. And the same principles apply here. If you want a fixed height, you can. A lot of times we'll put a height on the header of 125 pixels or something like that. Width, generally the width is going to go all the way across the layout, all the way across the container. When we're dealing with a container with a set pixel, it's pretty easy. We make those the same pixels. For example, we typically do 955 pixels. If the container is 955, we can typically make the header 955. But when we start working with fluid designs and percentage-based designs, that changes. The rule says we're dealing with a percentage of the box that we're in or the div that we're in. So when I'm looking at the width here, if I'm saying, okay, maybe the container is 90%, I'd like it to match, let me try to set it to 90% and see what happens. And you might be surprised at what we get. And also, I'm going to go ahead and put on a background color because it's very, very hard to see where this is happening. And again, I'll just kind of continue with my shades of gray. I'll make this AAA. Should be just a little darker than the container. And there we go. The header is in place. It starts on the upper left, but look at that. It doesn't go all the way across the container. My container stops right here at 90% of the width of the screen. The header, if I put 90 then, goes 90% the width of the container. It goes 90% of the width of the box that it's in. Well, I don't want that. I don't want it to go only 90% across. I want it to go 100%. So the header is going to be 100% of the width of the container. That should give me the result I'm looking for, where header now goes all the way across. No matter how wide or thin my browser window gets, the header goes all the way across the container. Navigation is going to be the same way, same basic principle here, #nav. I'll do the same thing. I'll go ahead and give it a fixed height. I'd like to make it a height of around 40 pixels. I'll give it a width also of 100%. And of course, if you want to give it a background color, you are welcome to as well. So background color. And we'll add a little splash of blue to our design here. I'll use my customary 963 or 369. So my navigation, as I expand my browser windows, expands with it. Does exactly what it's supposed to do. Now the nice thing about this feature is if I'm doing this for a client, the client comes back and says, hey, you know what, I'm really happy with the design, but I don't like the overall width. It's a little too much for me. Can you shrink that down? I can move my container down to 80%, and it will change the container, but it won't affect, or the divs inside won't really have to be redone due to that, because they're already set up to be 100% of the width of the container. Everything inside the container needs to add up to 100%. As we're looking here at the internal columns, I'm going to go ahead and drop in C1, and C2 will follow in just a few moments. For general columns in a website design, we generally have a float. I'll give this a float of left, so it'll be my left column. We give it a width, and this time, since we're not going to make these add up to be 955 pixels or whatever your fixed width might be, they're going to have to add up to 100%. So if I want my first column to be smaller, maybe I'll make my first column 30%. And it's going to be harder to see this without a little color in there, but the first column is staying at 30%, and the second column is just sort of taking up the rest. Now I would want to go ahead and put in column 2. I'll give it a float of right, since it's going to be my rightmost column, and a width of 70%. If you're thinking, how did I get to 70? 70 plus 30 equal 100. So I need 70% and 30% to add up to be 100%. And we can put some colors on there if you'd like. If you need to see that visually, feel free to do so. But I don't really see any change here just yet. Now, as I add more content to these columns, we'll see these columns expand, these divs expand, and so will my container. The last div I have on the screen is footer. And if you remember, a footer is essentially the same thing as a container. I need to give it a margin of auto. I need to give it you can give it a set height if you'd like, unlike the container. I'll give it a height of maybe 100 pixels. Background color. Give it another gray. And finally, I'll give it a width that matches the container, in this case 80%. So don't forget to save and refresh your browser every time. But again, as I continue to expand and contract this browser window, my layout changes with it. Now the advantages of this type of layout, if you don't notice it already, are that it eliminates a lot of that extra space out here on the sides. You know, if you've got a huge monitor, there's a lot of space out there on the sides with a 955 fixed width. As monitors continue to get larger and larger, you know, where a 27-inch monitor is not unheard of at this point, that's, you know, actually quite common. We're going to see more and more uses for that space out there. A lot of web designs have actually started placing ads in that excess space, but fluid design gives you an opportunity to minimize it. You know, you can set your design up to whatever percent you want, and just give yourself a little bit of space out there. One last thought that I'll leave you with on this design, and that is when you're dealing with your columns, column 1 and column 2, we haven't played with margins or padding in here. Those have to be taken into account as well. So, you know, if you want to put in some sort of 2% pad on each side, you would decrease this by 4. So we could put in, for example, a 26% width, and then we could do padding 0 for the top and bottom, and then we'll go ahead and put in 2% for the left and right. So I don't want any pad on the top and bottom, but I do want a little pad on the left and right. And I could do this the exact same way. Padding is going to be 0 for the top and bottom and 2% for the left and right. That means I have to deduct 4% from this. 2% from the left, 2% from the right. That will leave us with 66. So now the math gets a little bit harder. 26 plus 2 plus 2 plus 66 plus 2 plus 2 should equal 100. And we can verify that. And again, without a lot of background color and content in here, it's a little bit hard to see. But some older versions of Internet Explorer really struggled with this concept. One rule of thumb that designers have used over the ages for this technology is to make everything add up to 99%. Don't make it add up to 100, because Internet Explorer has problems sometimes when things add up to exactly 100. Sometimes it would put things on another line and act like it didn't fit. So that mostly ended with Internet Explorer 6, maybe a few problems with Internet Explorer 7, but we're on IE 10 at this point. Most people are on 8 or 9 at the very least, so I don't think that's a big problem to even mention. The last part of this demo that I want to go over is something called absolute positioning. And this doesn't have much to do with fluid design as much as it does just this presents an opportunity to talk about something called absolute positioning. Absolute positioning is essentially excuse me, the opposite of centering. When we're creating our layouts, we generally center them in the middle of our screen by putting on a margin auto. If you've ever tried to leave that margin auto off of your container, for example, if I just take it off here, it will left align to the upper left-hand corner of your browser window that div, no matter if it's fixed width or fluid width. It automatically positions everything from the upper left corner. Well, we can add something in here called position absolute. And at that point, we would need to add in some coordinates, a top and left coordinate. And what we would do here is essentially count the pixels that we want to move it. So if we wanted this container to be pushed down 50 pixels from the top and 200 pixels from the left, we could say top is 50 pixels, the left we said 200 pixels. And before I refresh, pay attention to this upper left-hand corner right here, right above the H in header. As soon as I click refresh, this whole div is going to move over 200 and down 50. And there we go, over 200 and down 50. So right here is our container that's now positioned in that place. And if I start to move my browser window around, you'll see that everything sort of expands and contracts except for that container. That container is not moving. It is 50 from the top and 200 from the left. Absolute positioning has its uses. It's not used very much anymore because with the development of mobile devices and responsive design, there's just less of a place for it. So for example, if you've got a phone with a width of 300 pixels, I can't even shrink my browser window down any less than this, but we know this is 200 over, so 300 is going to be about right here. You would essentially not be able to see anything from this point over, and that's going to include most of our navigation. So absolute positioning isn't something you're going to use a lot of, especially at high numbers like 50 and 200, but I at least want to throw the notion out there that you can place things on your screen, not necessarily in the center, although the centering is a wonderful concept and a wonderful layout technique. Another problem we see here is that when we absolute position this container, footer kind of comes up behind it, almost layers itself underneath it, and moves up the screen. The footer is still centered. We still have margin of auto on it. We have not changed the positioning whatsoever. So when we look at that footer, it doesn't have coordinates, so it's falling into place where it thinks it should, which is to start at the top. So not only does absolute positioning give us the opportunity to move things from the upper left corner, from the top or the left, it also gives us an opportunity to layer things. Now, for those designs in the past that have been created with absolute positioning, generally everything has to be created with absolute positioning. Otherwise, you're going to get some strange overlaps like we are here with our footer. So if I were going to do this as a real design, I would have to put absolute positioning on the footer and tell it to appear, a certain pixel from the left and the top as well. It's a lot harder to work with. But since we are in the society today where everything is all about mobile, I would leave out absolute positioning entirely and simply leave in the margin of auto. I'm going to go ahead and just comment this out. The CSS comment is slash star star slash or slash asterisk slash, and you can put that on its own line if you want, or you can put that just to the immediate left of whatever you're trying to comment out and the right of the last line. But I'm commenting that out. I'll leave it in there just for archival purposes, and I'll put my margin of auto back in and save this and look at this in a browser. And even though it doesn't look like much, it still looks better than it did with absolute positioning, in my opinion at least. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight about percentage-based fluid or liquid design. Again, it's not something you see used a lot today, but at least it's sort of a baby step to responsive design. One of the problems designers have had since day one of the internet has been making websites appear like they desire on different size monitors. And when I started in web design many years ago, our biggest concern was if someone was using a 13 or 15-inch monitor. And when 17-inch monitors came out, we didn't know what to do. So the fact that now we're dealing with 2-inch monitors on a smartphone to a 10-foot projector, 10-foot screen on a projector that's being displayed on a wall somewhere, we have so many resolutions. We just can't really dictate in all cases what the layout's going to look like or design is going to show up like. So as we're kind of getting geared up for responsive a little bit, this kind of sets the stage. So hopefully this wasn't too difficult to figure out that percentage-based design is really just changing your width from a pixel unit to a percent. So thanks a lot for checking out my videos, and hopefully I'll see you again soon virtually. Thanks a lot.